In the introduction to his work, Orientalism, Edward Said offers numerous definitions of Orientalism. He acknowledges that it is a very broad field of literature, making it difficult to assign a single specific meaning that encompasses every aspect of the predominantly Western writers who have written about the Orient. For the first time mentioning Aeschylus by name, Said defines Orientalism as follows. It can be discussed and analyzed as the corporate institution for dealing with the Orient, dealing with it by making statements about it, authorizing views of it, describing it by teaching it, setting it, ruling over it. In short, Orientalism as a Western style for dominating, restricting, and having authority over the Orient. Before discussing Aeschylus further, it is important to note his play The Persians, which is perhaps one of the earliest plays in which the entire story revolves around people from a foreign land. The characters were all Persians presented on the Greek stage. The play was written 8 years after the war with the Persians, during which the Greeks had witnessed tremendous destruction of their lands. Some historians also mention that Aeschylus fought in the battle. He was not only a poet and thinker, but also a great warrior. The play is set in Susa, an ancient city in the lower Zagros Mountains, about 250 kilometers east of the Tigris, in what is now modern-day Iran. The play is a kind of fantasy that depicts the Athenians as supreme over the Persians. Historians have discussed it as a form of imagination taking place in the mind of Aeschylus, shaping how he constructed his play. Said recognizes this in the Persian and wrote, "The principal product of this exteriority is, of course, representation. As in Aeschylus' play, The Persians, the Orient is transformed from distant and often threatening otherness into figures that are relatively familiar. The dramatic immediacy of representation in The Persians obscure the fact that the audience is watching a highly artificial enactment of what a non-Oriental has made it into a symbol for the whole Orient." He further elaborates on the defeated nature of Asia, stating, "In Aeschylus, Asia speaks through the old queen. In this instance, the old queen, mother of Xerxes." There is an analogy between Aeschylus' orchestra, which contains the static world as the playwright covers it and conceives it, and the learned envelope of Orientalist scholarship, which also holds within it the vast, amorphous static sprawl, for sometimes sympathetic but always dominating scrutiny. After reading Said, it seems that it is truly Asia that is mourning its losses through the depictions we receive from the West, particularly the Greeks, as addressed here, mainly through Aeschylus. In discussing Aeschylus, Said also explains that history does not always have to be written by the powerful. There exists a real history that can provide a more authentic understanding of the true nature of past events. Reading further, we find a quotation from the Persians where the chorus sings of Xerxes' failure. From history, as Herodotus explains in detail, and from the Greek perspective itself, the character of Xerxes is not portrayed as a noble figure, unlike Cyrus the Great, who was highly respected even by the Greeks and often referred to simply as the king. Xerxes does not share the same reputation. The question before us is whether Aeschylus was truly creating a fictionalized portrayal of the Persians. I deliberately use the term Persians rather than Orient for a specific reason, which I will attempt to explain. While it is true that the Persians contains elements of fiction, it is important to note that Aeschylus was not present when Xerxes returned to Persia after the war. The Greek-Persian relationship was highly complex, and beyond that, Aeschylus' personal emotions played a significant role in shaping the play. Historians mention that he lost his brother in the war against the Persians, and it is evident that such a loss would have influenced his portrayal of events. There is a sense of both sympathy and a depiction of the Persians' downfall. As Said also highlights, Aeschylus sought to portray the fall of Xerxes and what he represented in the Dionysian theater. He wanted to illustrate Xerxes' mistake in waging war against the Athenians and how even his own father, Darius, found his actions disgraceful, openly criticizing him in the play. Said's acknowledgement about the dominating view in the Persians is to some extent true. However, if this dominance influenced the Orientalist tradition, then what about the works written by Persians about the Greek world? Did works such as those of Nizami, who wrote about Alexander, play any role in shaping Orientalist ideas in the West? One of the greatest questions that continues to challenge historians concerns the Romans, who trace their origins to disputed relationships. Their cities were found in the blood of foreigners and women who were forcibly married to men, forming the very lineage from which the Romans claimed their heritage. Whether this is fantasy or reality, Said does not include this portion of history in his work. He does not even mention what Herodotus has to say about the characters in Aeschylus' play, where many ideas were refined and distilled into a form of historical representation. The plays and tragedies staged in Athenian theaters were subject to fiction and were presented to audience within the context of political and economic realities. A good example is The Clouds by Aristophanes, where Socrates is portrayed as a sophist rather than the philosopher we recognize today. In many ways, these dramatic works shaped Greek culture, but does not mean that readers or audience of the time were truly learning how to depict foreign cultures from these playwrights. If that were the case, then we must also consider the world that emerged after Alexander's conquest, followed by the Roman and later Muslim empires. Numerous travelers such as Ibn Fadlan, Ibn Jubayr, famous for his travel writings, Al-Idrisi, and most notably Ibn Battuta, wrote extensively about the European world of their time. Their works, like those of Greek and Roman writers, offer perspectives on foreign culture, raising the question, should we only scrutinize Orientalist depictions from the West, or should we also examine how non-Western scholars portrayed the West? There were so many other things regarding the Greeks that I did not mention, like their high claims that their knowledge was greatly influenced by the Egyptians, or in other words, the Orient. Said has a phrase about this, as he writes that the later Orientalists wanted to find the Orient of Herodotus and Diodorus, but all they found were people who were not what they imagined. Now let me link this to my new exploration, which I will be undertaking after this video, which I hope is the final video on Orientalism, mainly on Said's works. The civilization of Egypt was not only fascinating for the Orientalists or historians like Herodotus, who visited there and recorded many things from there. It was fascinating even for the Egyptians themselves. Later Muslim historians wrote extensively about the civilization of Egypt, where the main idea that we can find in many of their works was that Egypt was a civilization that had traces before the flood. This topic has nothing to do with Aeschylus, but has something to do with Said's argument about literatures that were written about Egypt. Now it would be a problem for us to consider that Aeschylus' play had influences on the Orientalist. It could be possible, but if it is possible, then we must also acknowledge that history was never the standard of looking at things. Rather, myth was what shaped our history. And we even find a lot of efforts by historians to clarify a claim, just like Herodotus did after Aeschylus, not only with other things, but regarding the elements and people of the play itself that were described by Aeschylus. Herodotus tells us that the sack of Miletus was staged long before the play in question. He describes the Athenians' reaction, saying the Athenians made clear their deep grief for the taking of Miletus in many ways, but especially in this, when Phrynichus wrote a play entitled The Sack of Miletus and produced it, the whole theater fell weeping. They charged Phrynichus 1,000 some for bringing to the mind a calamity that affected them so personally and forbade the performance of the play forever. For this account, we see that Athenian historical plays did not only celebrate their superiority, but also portrayed their suffering and failure in the wars against the Persians. Since we do not have the play, we can only speculate that it might have depicted the suffering of the Greeks at the hands of Persians. If this portrayal is problematic for depicting the Orient as savage and brutal, then the Persians, which celebrated the defeat of the Persians, could be viewed in a similar light. It is difficult to determine the intent behind the depiction. If the portrayal focused on failure, it could be argued that it aims to represent the culture as defeated. On the other hand, if it highlights victory, it might be seen as emphasizing the brutality of that culture. Given this dilemma, it becomes challenging to take a definitive stance on the argument. Anyways, the Persians may have been influenced by an earlier, now lost play called The Phoenician Woman, which is believed to have had a similar storyline. However, due to the lack of resources, our knowledge on this remains unclear. Moving on forward, it is very difficult to think that the scholars who paid a huge amount of attention to history and narrations, as I discussed in my previous videos, would take influence from Aeschylus' play. And even if we collect all the writings from other authors who wrote stories and fantasies, it is very difficult to make the point that the play, The Persians, has something to do with representation and capturing the Orient, and then representing it in its own interest. Now, as I mentioned before, this was my last video in the Orientalism series. And up to the extent that I recorded all these videos, Edward Said's work is remarkable in many ways, but on some occasions, it largely contributes to a meaning that he tried to find out that was not there. And in doing so, he created his own imagined view of the subject. I also didn't mention many thinkers and scholars that Said included in his works, who must be represented fairly. I will continue exploring historians, as I believe that confining knowledge within a single discipline was, and it still is, not an ideal approach in our major educational institutes. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.